You've outlived your usefulness. He said it over the phone, flat and unbothered, like he was reading it off a form instead of saying it to a man who'd paid into that fund for 34 straight years. You've outlived your usefulness to this fund, Mr. Ferris. My pension administrator said it without so much as a pause to consider what those words might do to a 68-year-old man sitting alone in his kitchen. The groundskeeper at my club, a kid barely old enough to rent a car, was the only person who didn't need to be asked twice to do something about it. I'm 68 years old, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. This isn't a story about a pension fund. It's a story about which people in your life actually owe you nothing and show up anyway, and which ones owe you everything on paper and vanish the second honoring that debt becomes income. Let me back up. I live outside Dayton, Ohio, in the same house I bought in 1987 with Carol, my wife of 39 years, who passed 18 months ago from a stroke that gave us no warning at all. I spent 34 years on the floor at Bramwell Manufacturing, running a stamping press for the first decade and supervising a full shift for the two after that. The kind of steady, unglamorous work that built a house, put two kids through state school, and was supposed to guarantee me a pension I could actually count on once my knees finally gave out on that floor for good. I remember starting at Bramwell the same month Gary was born, 28 years old with a newborn son, and a mortgage payment that felt impossibly large at the time. Walking onto that stamping floor for the first time in a pair of steel-toed boots I'd bought secondhand because new ones cost more than we could spare that month. I worked my way up slow, the way you're supposed to, learning every machine on that floor before I ever asked for a supervisor's title. And by the time I finally got it, 12 years in, I understood every single job on that line well enough to do it myself if a man called in sick. Carol used to say I loved that plant more than I loved most people, and she wasn't entirely wrong, not because I loved the work itself, though I did, in the particular way you can love something that asks everything of you and gives back a paycheck and a sense of purpose in roughly equal measure, but because that plant represented something I'd built with my own two hands, the same way Carol and I built our marriage and our family, slow and steady, one reliable day at a time. Welcome to Brian's Revenge. If that opening's already sitting heavy in your chest, that's exactly where I need you. Hit that like button, tell me where you're watching from, and stay with me, because what happened over the following months is going to show you exactly who actually shows up when the people who owe you the most decide you're not worth the trouble anymore. Bramwell got bought out by a larger conglomerate 19 years ago. The plant itself closed 6 years after that, and the pension fund that had once been managed in-house by people who actually knew my name got handed off to a third-party administrator, a company called Meridian Trust that manages retirement obligations for a few dozen defunct manufacturers across the Midwest, a faceless outfit that knows me only as an account number. I remember the last day that plant operated, walking the floor one final time after the closure announcement, running my hand along machines I'd spent decades keeping in working order, thinking about all the men I'd trained over the years, some of whom had gone on to other plants, others who'd simply aged out of the workforce the way I eventually did myself. It felt, that day, like watching a piece of my own life get boxed up and shipped off somewhere I'd never see it again. And in a way, I suppose that's exactly what happened. The plant demolished 4 years later to make room for a distribution warehouse that employs a fraction of the people Bramwell once did, at a fraction of the wages, with none of the pension security we'd all once taken for granted. I joined the Hollowbrook Golf Club the year after I retired, a modest public course with a clubhouse that still smells like the same coffee it smelled like for 30 years, because Carol thought it would be good for me to have somewhere to go most mornings, somewhere with other people in it. I walked that course most days, rain or shine, long before my knees started complaining hard enough that I had to give up an actual round for just the walking part of it. I've been a member there for 11 years now, longer than I managed some of the men who worked under me on that stamping floor. If you've made it this far, I want you to hold on to that detail about Hollowbrook, because it matters for everything that comes after, more than I understood myself for a long while. Carol's death hit me harder than I let most people see. We'd built our whole retirement around each other's company, morning coffee on the back porch, drives out to see our daughter in Columbus every few months, the small, ordinary rhythm of a marriage that had simply worked for 39 years, without either of us ever quite articulating how rare that actually is. When she was gone, that rhythm just stopped, all at once, and I found myself, in the months after, walking that golf course earlier and earlier in the morning, mostly because the empty house had gotten hard to sit in with the sun barely up. I remember the morning of her funeral with a clarity I wish I didn't have, standing in a receiving line at the funeral home, shaking hands with people who kept telling me she was in a better place now, nodding along because that's what you do, all while some cold, disconnected part of my mind kept insisting this was a mistake, that I'd go home that evening and she'd be there in the kitchen, the way she'd been there every single evening for 39 years. Gary and Diane both flew in for the service, stayed the better part of a week helping me sort through some of her things, and I remember being grateful for that week in a way I don't think I fully expressed to either of them at the time, too raw myself to manage much beyond simply getting through each day. They both went back to their own lives after that week, the way you have to eventually, Gary back to Charlotte and his own family, Diane back to Columbus and her 2 young kids, and I understood even then that grief doesn't work on anybody else's schedule but your own, that the empty house I was left standing in was mine alone to figure out how to live inside of. That's where I met Milo. He's 22, works the grounds crew at Hollowbrook, mowing fairways and setting pin placements before the sun's even fully cleared the tree line. The kind of job most members of that club, myself included for most of my life, never think twice about the person actually doing it. I started running into him most mornings, both of us out on that course before anybody else was awake, and somewhere over that first year of early mornings, without either of us quite deciding to, we became something like friends, an old retired factory supervisor and a 22-year-old kid mowing greens for minimum wage plus tips nobody remembers to leave. I remember our first real conversation clearly, maybe 4 months after Carol passed, Milo pausing his mower on the 4th fairway to ask, careful in the way young people sometimes are around grief they don't fully know how to address, whether I was doing all right, whether the walking helped. I told him the truth, that some mornings it did and some mornings it didn't, and he nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable answer, and went back to mowing without pushing further, which I appreciated more than I let on at the time. Over the following months, those brief exchanges turned into something more regular, Milo timing his breaks to catch me on my walk some mornings, both of us sitting on a bench near the 9th hole talking about nothing important and everything important in equal measure. He told me about his own life, working 2 jobs to save toward community college, his mother's long hours at a hospital laundry facility, a father who'd left when Milo was young enough that I told him about Bramwell, about Carol, about the particular strange grief of missing someone in the small, ordinary moments more than the big ones, the empty side of the bed, the extra place setting I still sometimes put out of habit. There was a morning, maybe 8 months into this new routine, when Milo showed up to our usual bench looking exhausted in a way I hadn't seen from him before. And it came out slowly that he'd been picking up extra shifts at a warehouse on weekends, on top of his grounds crew hours, trying to save enough for his first semester of classes that fall. I asked him why he didn't just take out loans like most kids his age, and he told me, with a kind of quiet pride I recognized from my own younger self, that he didn't want to start his adult life already buried in debt if he could help it, that his mother had drilled that into him since he was small. I found myself, over that year, looking forward to those mornings more than I probably should have admitted to anyone. A friendship I hadn't expected and hadn't gone looking for, filling a space in my week that had gone quiet since Carol passed. My son Gary lives in Charlotte, 3 hours by plane, calls on holidays and manages, in a general sense, to remember my birthday, though the specifics of my actual life, my pension, my health, my grief, have mostly become things he assumes are handled unless I say otherwise. My daughter Diane's in Columbus, closer, better about calling, but with 2 young kids of her own and a job that eats most of her hours. Her attention for my life comes in smaller, more distracted pieces than either of us would probably like to admit. I'm not telling you that to be bitter about my children. I'm telling you because it matters for understanding exactly how much room was left in my life for somebody else entirely, a groundskeeper barely out of his teens, to end up mattering as much as he eventually did. My trouble with Meridian Trust started about 8 months ago, a letter arriving that used the phrase benefit recalculation in a way that made my stomach drop before I'd even finished reading the first paragraph. The letter explained, in language dense enough that I had to read it 4 times to understand what it was actually saying, that an internal audit had identified a calculation error in my original pension benefit, dating back to my retirement 19 years earlier, and that Meridian Trust intended to recover the alleged overpayment by suspending my monthly benefit entirely until the recovered amount, some $11,000 they claimed I'd been overpaid across nearly, had been fully clawed back. I remember sitting at that same kitchen table, reading that letter over and over, the particular disorienting feeling of watching numbers on a page rearrange 19 years of careful budgeting into something suddenly precarious. Carol and I had planned our whole retirement around that monthly benefit, modest but reliable, enough to cover the mortgage and the utilities, and a little left over for the occasional dinner out or a visit to see Diane and the grand. I sat there doing the math 6 different ways, and every single time it came out the same. Without that check, I had maybe 4 months of savings before things got genuinely difficult. I called their customer service line the same afternoon, sat on hold for 40 minutes, and finally reached a man named Curtis Vance, an account manager whose voice carried the particular practiced patience of someone who fields exactly this kind of panicked call several times a day, and has long since stopped being moved by any of them. "Mr. Ferris," he told me, "the recalculation stems from a reclassification of your final pay grade at the time of retirement. Our audit found the original benefit was calculated using an incorrect base salary figure. We're required by our fiduciary obligations to correct that going forward." Required by whose fiduciary obligations? I asked him, my voice not entirely steady. "I've been receiving that benefit for 19 years, Mr. Vance. Nobody flagged an error in 19 years. That doesn't change our obligation to correct it now," he said, and I remember, even through the phone, how utterly unbothered he sounded, like he was explaining a return policy rather than telling a 68-year-old widower that his only income was about to stop. I want you to sit with that phone call the way I had to sit with it afterward, alone in a kitchen that still had Carol's reading glasses sitting on the windowsill where she'd left them the last morning of her life. 34 years on that floor, 19 years of a pension I'd budgeted my entire retirement around, and a stranger telling me, in the careful, bloodless language of institutional correction, that the mistake was mine to absorb regardless of whose error had actually caused it. If this story's got a knot forming in your stomach already, that's exactly where I need you to be. Because what happened over the following weeks is the part where you find out exactly who in my life actually noticed something was wrong, and who simply assumed, the way people do, that an old man's problems were his own to manage quietly. I didn't tell Gary or Diane right away. I want to be honest about why. Some old, stubborn piece of me didn't want either of my children to see me as a man whose finances had come apart, didn't want to be the parent who calls with a problem instead of the one who still, occasionally, manages to help them with theirs. I told myself I'd figure it out, appeal the decision myself, handle it the way I'd handled every other piece of paperwork life had thrown at me for 68 years. Milo noticed before either of my own children did, which tells you something, though I didn't fully understand what it told me until much later. He noticed I'd stopped ordering the $2 coffee I used to get from the clubhouse most mornings, noticed I was walking the course a little slower, carrying something in my shoulders that hadn't been there before. He asked me directly, one morning in early spring, mowing paused, leaning on the handle of his push mower like he had all the time in the world for whatever answer I gave him. "Mr. Ferris, you doing all right? You've seemed off the last couple weeks." I told him the truth, mostly because I was too tired that particular morning to construct a version of it that sounded less pathetic than the actual situation. I told him about the letter about Curtis Vance, about $11,000, and a monthly check that had simply stopped arriving 3 weeks earlier. Milo didn't say much right away. He just stood there with his hand still on that mower handle, working something through in his own head, and then he asked me a question that ended up mattering more than either of us understood in that moment. "Mr. Ferris, did you work at Bramwell, the old stamping plant out on Route 4? 34 years, I told him. "Why do you ask? My grandfather worked there too," he said. "Union steward most of his career. He passed a few years back, but my mom still got boxes of his old paperwork in her garage. Contracts, meeting minutes, all kinds of stuff from back then. I used to think it was just junk nobody was ever going to look at again." I didn't think much of that conversation at the time, beyond a small, warm surprise that this kid mowing greens at 7 in the morning had a grandfather who'd once walked the same factory floor I had. I didn't understand yet that those boxes in his mother's garage were about to become the reason this whole story turned out the way it did. Welcome back to Brian's Revenge if you're just joining us. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what Milo did over the following months, entirely on his own time, unpaid and unasked, is the reason I'm sitting here telling you any of this at all. My health started giving me real trouble about 6 weeks into the pension freeze, a pain in my lower back that turned out, after an MRI I could barely afford the copay for, to be a herniated disc requiring a procedure my doctor recommended sooner rather than later, given how much the pain was already limiting my mobility. The procedure itself, with my Medicare coverage, still required a deposit of $3,900 I simply didn't have anymore, not with my only monthly income suspended, and my modest savings account draining faster than I'd ever planned for. I remember the appointment where Dr. Havorson delivered that news, sitting in an exam room that felt smaller than it probably was, doing math in my head even as he explained the procedure's specifics, running through my dwindling savings account balance, and coming up short every single time. I asked him, somewhat desperately, whether there was a way to manage the pain without the procedure, buy myself more time until the pension situation resolved itself. And he told me kindly but firmly that waiting risked permanent nerve damage, that this wasn't the kind of thing that got better with patience alone. I called Meridian Trust again, hoping, foolishly, that a medical necessity might soften the position Curtis Vance had taken on my case. It didn't, Mr. Ferris, he told me, his voice carrying the same unbothered patience as before. I understand this is difficult, but our recovery process has to proceed according to policy regardless of individual circumstances. I'd encourage you to look into Medicare assistance programs in the meantime. I sat in my truck outside the clinic after that call, my back aching, thinking about 34 years of showing up to that stamping floor at 6 in the morning, rain or shine. Never once late, never once calling in without good reason, and a voice on the other end of a phone line telling me, essentially, that none of it obligated the institution I'd trusted with my retirement to treat me like anything more than a line item that had become inconvenient to manage. I spent that evening looking into the Medicare assistance programs Curtis Vance had so casually suggested, filling out preliminary applications online, understanding within an hour that even the fastest of those programs would take weeks to process. Weeks I didn't have if I wanted to avoid the nerve damage Dr. Havorson had warned me about. I remember sitting at that same kitchen table well past midnight, the house silent around me the way it had been silent for 18 months, feeling, for the first time since Carol passed, truly and completely alone with a problem I couldn't see any clear way through. I called Gary that evening finally, ashamed at how long I'd waited, and explained the situation as calmly as I could manage. He was sympathetic, genuinely, but distracted in the particular way people get distracted when a problem exists 3 hours away and doesn't touch their own daily life directly. Dad, that sounds like a mess. Have you talked to a lawyer? I can look into it when things calm down at work, maybe next month. I told him I understood, and I did understand, in the sense that I know my son has his own life, his own pressures, his own reasonable limits on how much bandwidth he has for a problem that isn't actively on fire in front of him. I hung up understanding, in a way I hadn't quite let myself understand before, that whatever urgency I felt about this situation, my own son was going to feel it on a different, slower timeline entirely. Milo found out about the procedure the same week, mentioned almost in passing when he asked why I was walking even more carefully than usual, and I want you to understand exactly what he did next, because it's the reason this story exists at all. I remember trying that same conversation to deflect his question, told him it was nothing serious, just an old man's back acting up the way old backs do. Milo didn't buy it for a second, pressed gently until I finally told him the whole situation, the procedure, the cost, the pension freeze that had left me without any real way to cover it. He went quiet for a long moment, leaning on that mower handle, working something through in his own mind, and I could see, even then, some decision forming behind his eyes that I didn't yet understand the shape of. If you're still with me, that tells me something about you. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss where this one goes. Hit that like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Milo did next is the reason an $11,000 clawback and a faceless account manager didn't end up being the last word on any of this. Milo showed up at my door 2 days later with an envelope, said he'd talked to his mom, that between the two of them they'd managed to put together $1,400, most of it Milo's own savings from 3 years of grounds crew wages, and that he'd already talked to the clinic's billing office about a payment plan for the rest. Milo, I can't take this from you. This is your savings. It's not doing me any good sitting in an account while you're in this much pain, mister. Ferris, he said, the same steady, matter-of-fact tone he uses about almost everything. You've bought me lunch probably 200 mornings over the last 3 years and never once made it feel like charity. Let me do this. Please. I want you to sit with that math for a second, the way I had to sit with it. A 22-year-old groundskeeper, making barely above minimum wage, handed over 3 years of savings to a 68-year-old man he had absolutely no obligation to help, while my own son, financially secure, 3 hours away by plane, offered sympathy and a vague promise to look into it once things calmed down. I learned later, from his mother when I finally met her properly at the resolution meeting, that Milo had actually been saving that money specifically for his first semester at community college that fall, a goal he'd been chipping away at for nearly 2 years working 2 jobs simultaneously. He handed it to me anyway, without hesitation, and told his mother, when she gently asked if he was certain, that community college would still be there next year, but he wasn't sure how many more mornings he'd get to walk that course with Mr. Ferris if the pain kept him from moving at all. That's the difference, if you want it in one sentence before I go any further. Gary owed me nothing on paper and gave what his own comfortable timeline allowed. Milo owed me nothing on paper either, and gave everything he had the moment it mattered. The procedure happened 3 weeks later, funded by Milo's savings, and a payment plan the clinic's billing office worked out for the rest. And it went well, clean recovery, though I spent the first several days barely able to get out of bed without help. Milo came by most evenings after his shift at the club ended, still in his work boots, to check on me, heat up something simple for dinner, and sit with me while I worked through the particular boredom and discomfort of a slow recovery. I remember one evening in particular, about 4 days into my recovery, Milo sitting on the edge of my bed with a bowl of soup he'd made from a recipe he admitted, sheepishly, he'd found online that afternoon because he didn't actually know how to cook much beyond grilled cheese. It wasn't very good, truthfully, too much salt and not enough of anything else, and I remember laughing for the first time in weeks over that soup, a real laugh, the kind that surprised both of us with how much I'd apparently needed it. Milo laughed too, admitted the recipe had probably been a bad choice, and we sat there that evening eating mediocre soup and watching an old Western on my television. And I remember thinking, somewhere in that ordinary hour, that I hadn't felt this cared for since before Carol got sick. There was another evening, closer to 2 weeks into my recovery, when Milo showed up later than usual, explained he'd picked up an extra shift at the warehouse again to cover some of what he'd given me, and I felt a fresh wave of guilt hearing that. Told him again that he shouldn't be sacrificing his own savings and his own rest for an old man's medical bills. He set his bag down by the door and looked at me for a long moment before he answered, "Mr. Ferris, can I tell? My grandfather died when I was 12. I don't remember him all that well, honestly, just pieces, the smell of his workshop, the sound of his voice. I never really had an older man in my life after that, not one who actually paid attention, anyway. These last few years, our mornings on that course, that's meant more to me than you probably realize. Letting me help you with this, it's not a sacrifice, Mr. Ferris. It's just what you do for people who matter to you." I didn't have much to say back to that, not right away, my throat too tight to manage a proper response. I just nodded, and Milo, understanding exactly what that nod meant without needing me to say more, went to go heat up dinner, competent enough by then, 2 weeks in, that it actually tasted decent. It was during one of those evenings, about a week into my recovery, that he brought up his grandfather's boxes again. "Mr. Ferris, I've been thinking about what you told me about the pension thing. I went out to my mom's this weekend and actually went through some of my grandfather's old union paperwork. There's a lot of it. I don't fully understand half of what I'm looking at, but I found something with Bramwell's name on it that mentions pension protections, and I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to look through it with me. I want you to understand what it felt like, recovering from surgery, 70 years old feeling every one of them, hearing a 22-year-old kid tell me he'd spent his weekend combing through his dead grandfather's paperwork, on the off chance it might help an old man he'd known for 3 years at a golf course. If this story's got you leaning forward, that's exactly where you should be, because what we found in those boxes over the following 2 weeks changed everything about what Meridian Trust actually had the right to do to my pension. Milo brought 3 boxes over that weekend, still in his grandfather's careful handwriting on masking tape labels, contracts and meeting minutes and grievance filings going back decades. We spent 2 full afternoons going through them together, Milo reading sections out loud when my eyes got tired, both of us slowly piecing together a picture of exactly what the union had negotiated for hourly employees like me back when Bramwell first started showing signs of financial trouble, 20-some years before the eventual sale. I remember the particular quality of those 2 afternoons, sitting at my kitchen table, with the same light coming through the window that used to catch Carol's reading glasses on the sill, Milo patient in a way that surprised me, willing to reread dense legal paragraphs 3 or 4 times, until we both understood what they actually meant. He'd stop sometimes, ask me questions about what the plant floor had actually been like back then, genuinely curious about a piece of his own grandfather's life he'd never gotten the chance to ask about directly. I found myself telling him stories I hadn't told anybody in years, about grievance meetings I'd sat in on as a young shop steward myself, about the particular camaraderie of a factory floor that doesn't exist in most workplaces anymore. We found it on the 2nd afternoon, buried in a 1998 collective bargaining agreement renewal, a section titled Pension Benefit Protection for Legacy Hourly Employees, language the union had fought hard for, according to the meeting minutes stapled behind it, specifically anticipating exactly the kind of situation I now found myself in. The clause stated, in language a labor attorney had clearly drafted with real care, that any hourly employee with 25 years or more of continuous service at the time of the agreement's ratification, which I qualified for by a full 9 years, would have their eventual pension benefit permanently protected from any future recalculation, audit-based reduction, or clawback claim initiated more than 5 years after the benefit's original commencement. Specifically to prevent exactly the kind of retroactive correction Meridian Trust was now attempting 19 years into my retirement. I read that clause 3 times, Milo sitting quietly beside me, both of us understanding, gradually, what we were actually looking at. Milo, I said, my voice not entirely steady, this protects me. This means what they are doing isn't just unkind. It's not something they are even allowed to do. Milo grinned, the first real grin I'd seen from him in weeks, and reached over to grab my hand, the same way you'd grab a friend's hand after a shared victory. We did it, Mr. Ferris. My grandfather did it 25 years ago, probably arguing with some company lawyer who thought nobody would ever actually need that clause. And now here we are. That's the moment something in me went quiet and cold and very, very clear. I didn't call Curtis Vance. I want you to remember that, because it matters for what comes later. I never went looking for a fight with Meridian Trust beyond simply wanting my benefit restored. I'd spent 8 months assuming, the way you assume when an institution tells you something with enough bureaucratic confidence, that they must know what they were legally entitled to do. I simply stopped assuming that, once a 22-year-old kid and his dead grandfather's paperwork proved otherwise. I called a labor attorney instead, a sharp, thorough woman in Dayton named Renata Osai, who specialized in exactly this kind of pension dispute. Renata, it's Douglas Ferris. I need you to look at something. I think a legacy protection clause in an old collective bargaining agreement might make my current pension dispute with Meridian Trust entirely improper on their part. I sent her photographs of every relevant page Milo and I had found, and she called back 4 days later, her voice carrying the particular energy of an attorney who's just found a genuinely strong case. Douglas, this is significant. That clause is unambiguous, and it was properly ratified and filed with the Department of Labor at the time, which means it survived the plant's sale and closure as a binding obligation on any subsequent pension administrator, including. Their entire recalculation and clawback attempt appears to be a direct violation of a legally protected benefit. Not only should your monthly payments be restored immediately, I believe you have a strong claim for the suspended payments plus damages for the financial hardship this has caused you. I sat there in my kitchen a long while after that call, thinking about a golf course before sunrise, about $1,400 a 22-year-old had handed me without a second thought, about a dead union steward's careful handwriting on a box of paperwork nobody in his own family had thought to look at again, until his grandson decided an old man's pension mattered enough to spend a weekend searching through it. Renata, I want to move on this properly, formally, and I want you to understand something before we do. Whatever comes from this in terms of restored payments or damages, I want a portion of it set aside separately, structured however makes the most sense, for somebody who isn't a party to this case at all. A young man named Milo Castellano. Renata didn't say anything for a second. Can you tell me more about that, Douglas? He's 22 years old, makes minimum wage plus tips mowing greens at my golf club, I said. He gave me 3 years of his own savings without blinking, spent his weekends going through his dead grandfather's paperwork on the chance it might help me, and never once asked for anything in return. I want to set up a fund for his education, whatever he decides to pursue, fully separate from anything Meridian Trust owes me directly. I'll fund it myself, from the restored payments and whatever damages come through. I understand completely, Renata said. I'll have the formal complaint filed within the month, and we can structure the fund alongside it. I hung up the phone and sat there a long while in my kitchen, listening to the quiet of a house that still had Carol's reading glasses on the windowsill, thinking about 3 cardboard boxes that had waited years in a garage for somebody to care enough to open them. They're going to find out eventually, I thought. Meridian Trust, my own children, everybody. And when they do, most of them are going to ask about the money, the way people always seem to, once the money's the only part left that's easy to see. I wasn't wrong about that part. I want you to hold on to that thought because it's exactly what happened, but not the way I expected, and not for the reason I expected. If you've stuck with this story all the way through, that tells me something about the kind of person you are. And I think you're going to want to see how Curtis Vance finds out, because he doesn't find out from a phone call. He finds out the way institutions like his usually find out, through a formal legal complaint that lands on his desk with far more weight behind it than he ever expected an old retiree's case to carry. 5 weeks after that call with Renata, my phone rang at 9 in the morning. A different voice this time. A regional director from Meridian Trust named Patricia Hollies, her tone considerably more careful than Curtis Vance's had ever managed to be. Mr. Ferris, I'm calling regarding the formal complaint your attorney filed. I want to personally apologize for how your case was handled, and I'd like to arrange a meeting to resolve this as quickly as possible. I found it strangely satisfying, hearing that careful new tone, understanding exactly what had produced it. I found it more satisfying still when she asked, almost as an afterthought, whether Curtis Vance would need to be present for the resolution meeting, and I told her that decision was entirely up to Meridian Trust, though I suspected, given what Renata had found in their internal correspondence during discovery, that his position at the company might not survive this particular case regardless of who attended any meeting. The resolution meeting happened 2 weeks later, not in some sterile Meridian Trust conference room, but at my request, at the Hollowbrook Clubhouse, the same clubhouse where I'd been quietly grieving my wife and quietly losing my pension in the same stretch of months. The same clubhouse where a 22-year-old groundskeeper had noticed something was wrong before either of my own children had. Patricia Hollies arrived with a folder thick enough to suggest Meridian Trust's legal team had spent considerable time preparing for a meeting they clearly understood they were going to lose. Curtis Vance came too, at her insistence I later learned, sat across that table from me looking considerably less unbothered than he'd sounded on the phone 8 months earlier. Milo was there too, at my invitation, sitting quietly beside me in his work boots, having come straight from a morning shift mowing the very fairways visible through the clubhouse windows behind us. "Mr. Ferris," Patricia began, "we've reviewed the legacy protection clause your attorney submitted, and Meridian Trust acknowledges the clawback attempt was made in error, in violation of a legally binding obligation we should have identified before initiating any recalculation. We're prepared to restore your full benefit immediately, retroactive to the date of suspension, plus the damages outlined in your attorney's complaint." I looked at Curtis Vance for a long moment before I answered, watching him sit there in a chair considerably less comfortable than the one he'd occupied on the other end of that phone call 8 months earlier. That's where I'm going to leave this for now. Because what happened next in that clubhouse, with a groundskeeper who'd fought harder for an old man's dignity than an institution legally obligated to protect it ever had, is a conversation that changes everything about what Meridian Trust and my own children are about to understand happened here. Patricia set that thick folder down on the table between us, and I watched Curtis Vance's eyes flick briefly toward Milo, clearly uncertain what a young groundskeeper was doing at a formal resolution meeting, before he seemed to decide it wasn't his place to ask. "Mr. Ferris," Patricia continued, "we'd like to discuss the terms of resolution. Full retroactive restoration of your benefit, back payment for the suspended months with interest, and a damages settlement to reflect the hardship this caused, including your medical procedure and the financial strain during that period. We're prepared to move quickly on all of this." "I appreciate that," I said, steady, "though I want to make something clear before we finalize anything. This entire resolution exists because a 22-year-old groundskeeper spent his own savings on my surgery and his own weekends going through his dead grandfather's paperwork, on his own time without being asked, while Meridian Trust spent 8 months treating me like a line item that had become inconvenient." Patricia glanced at Milo, something shifting in her expression, a genuine attempt at understanding rather than mere corporate courtesy. "Is that true?" she asked. Milo, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention in a room full of attorneys and executives, nodded slowly. "My grandfather was a union steward at Bramwell. He's the one who actually fought for that protection clause 25 years ago. I just found the paperwork." Curtis Vance spoke for the first time since sitting down, his voice carrying none of the flat confidence I remembered from that first phone call. "Mr. Ferris, I want to say, on a personal level, I'm sorry for how that initial call went. I was following protocol, but that doesn't excuse how it must have felt to hear." I looked at him for a long moment, thinking about $11,000, about a kitchen table with Carol's reading glasses still sitting on the windowsill, about 3 weeks of pain I could have avoided if a stranger's protocol had allowed for a single moment of actual consideration. "I appreciate you saying that, Curtis," I told him, "and I meant it, though I want you to understand something too. Protocol doesn't get to be the excuse for treating a person like they've outlived their usefulness. Somewhere in that protocol, there needs to be room for a human being to ask whether the correct process is also the right one." He nodded slowly, and I watched something genuine pass across his face. Not just professional discomfort, but something closer to real reflection. The kind that doesn't come easily to a man whose job has trained him to see people as accounts and case numbers, rather than lives interrupted by a single bloodless phone call. Patricia moved the conversation back toward the practical matters, walking through the specific figures, the timeline for restored payments, the damages calculation her legal team had prepared. I listened, signed where Renata indicated I should sign, and felt throughout that whole process a strange calm I hadn't expected to feel, watching an institution that had spent 8 months treating me as disposable now scrambling to make things right. Not out of genuine remorse necessarily, but because a dead union steward's paperwork had left them no other legally sound option. Before the meeting ended, I asked Patricia one more question, watching Curtis Vance. "How many other legacy employees might this same clawback process have affected?" I asked. "Men and women with the same protection clause in their contracts, who maybe didn't have a groundskeeper with access to the right paperwork to fight back." Patricia's expression told me she hadn't fully considered that question before I asked it. "I don't have that number in front of me, Mr. Ferris, but I promise you, given what we've just reviewed, we'll be conducting a full audit of every legacy Bramwell account under this administration." I want you to understand what that meant to me, sitting in that clubhouse, understanding that this wasn't just about restoring my own pension, but about however many other men and women out there, in kitchens not so different from mine, might be quietly absorbing the exact same injustice without a 22-year-old groundskeeper and 3 cardboard boxes to save them. After the meeting ended, after Patricia and Curtis had gathered their folders and left, Milo and I sat alone in that clubhouse for a while, the same clubhouse where he'd first asked me, gently, whether I was doing all right, months earlier, before either of us understood how much that early morning kindness was about to matter. "We did it, Mr. Ferris," he said again, quieter this time, more disbelieving than triumphant. "We did it," I agreed. "Or rather, your grandfather did it 25 years ago, and you did it by caring enough to go looking for what he left behind." I told him then about the fund, the education fund I'd already begun setting up with Renata, separate from anything Meridian Trust owed me directly, structured to cover whatever he decided to pursue, community college or a 4-year school or a trade program, whatever path he wanted for himself. He tried to refuse it at first, the same way he'd tried to refuse letting me repay the $1,400, and I told him, the same way he'd told me, that this wasn't a debt being settled. It was simply what you do for people who matter to you. Milo's eyes went wet, something I'd never seen from him in 3 years of early mornings on that golf course, and he didn't say much for a long moment, just sat there across from me in that quiet clubhouse, 2 people from different generations who'd found in each other exactly the kind of steady presence neither of us had realized how much we needed. Gary called 2 days after the resolution meeting, having heard about the settlement through Diane, who I'd finally told the whole story once it was resolved. His voice carried a mixture of relief and something else, something closer to guilt, though he didn't quite name it directly. "Dad, I'm glad this worked out. I wish you'd told me sooner how bad it had gotten." I told him, gently but honestly, that I had told him back when it started, and that his response at the time had been to suggest he'd look into it once things calmed down at work. I told him about Milo, about the $1,400, about 2 afternoons spent combing through a dead man's paperwork, and I heard something shift in my son's voice as I talked, a recognition, maybe, of exactly how much distance had grown between his version of showing up and what showing up had actually required these past 8 months. "I'm going to do better, Dad," he said, quiet. "I mean that. I believe you want to, Gary," I told him honestly. "I hope. But I want you to understand something too. I'm not telling you this story to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because I think it's worth understanding, for your own life going forward, that the people who actually show up when it counts aren't always the ones you'd expect, and the ones you assume will always be there sometimes need reminding that showing up is a choice you make in the moment, not a guarantee that comes with the relationship itself." I've thought a great deal, in the months since all of this happened, about what it actually means to be owed something on paper, by an institution or even by a family member, versus what it means to actually receive care from somebody who owes you nothing at all. Meridian Trust owed me, legally, contractually, the full weight of 34 years of service translated into a promise they were bound to keep. It took a lawsuit and a dead union steward's paperwork to make them. Milo owed me nothing. Not a single obligation, written or implied, bound him to spend his savings on my surgery or his weekends on my pension dispute. He did it anyway, the same steady way he shows up to mow greens before the sun's even fully up, because some people, it turns out, don't need a contract to understand what care actually requires of them. What I know for certain is this: the institutions and people who owe you the most on paper aren't always the ones who show up when the paper stops mattering and the actual moment of need arrives. Sometimes the person doing the truest showing up is the one nobody would have written into any contract at all, mowing a fairway at 6 in the morning, noticing you've stopped ordering your coffee, and deciding without being asked that your dignity is worth fighting for. Stay with me. Part 2 picks up exactly where this one stops, right there in that clubhouse, and it does not go the way Curtis Vance walked in expecting.